I'm Andy Odlin, and pleased to be your moderator today. It's been a pleasure working with this group of speakers and SAME. It's been a good team effort to pull it all together. Just a review of our learning objectives. I want to emphasize right up front that this is about water quality across the board, threats to water quality of all types. It is not just about PFAS, which has received a lot of attention of late. And first, our effort here will be to state the problem to our nation and to our military installations. And then second, what do we do about it? Offering solutions, hopefully leading to action. And third, consider how we and all of the organizations that you attendees represent can work together to pursue solutions through partnerships and upcoming opportunities to get together and maintaining the dialogue. Here's our distinguished panel of experts who have put forth a tremendous effort in response to water quality threats to our nation's health and well-being. I will introduce each speaker at the beginning of his portion of the briefing. And so we kick it off with Kurt Steenhoek, who is our first speaker, who leads the United Association's water quality program overall. His 36 years in the plumbing industry and advancement to international representative in 2016 put the right leader at the helm of this vital program. Kurt, take it away.
Hey, thank you very much, Andy, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our webinar. We're excited to introduce this program that we have to you and look forward to the discussions that we're going to have. As Andy stated, I work in the plumbing industry for the last 36 years. I serve as the project manager for the UA water quality team, which you'll be hearing about today. The UA, the United Association, if you will, is made up of 360,000 plumbers, pipe fitters, sprinkler fitters, and service journeymen in America and Canada, serving 3,000 plumbing and mechanical contractors nationwide. Today's presentation is about the emerging water quality crisis in America and the mechanical industry's approach in all sectors and including military installations. So this will cover all sectors of our work across America. We do have a quick video that we have. The video will be uploaded to the Community of Interest site under the environmental webpage, along with this PowerPoint for you to review at a later time. To set the stage, we must understand our basic water supply has several supply components. We have wells, we have rivers, reservoirs, recycled water. We have water treatment plants then supplying the water to the systems. We have wastewater treatment plants supplying water back into our water systems. And the key point that I want to make here is that various contaminants can jeopardize our water and present public health risk to the people that are drinking this water. The responsibility and all stakeholders must work on water quality, right? We need to deliver the water to these homes in a safe manner to all end users. If we take a look at the risks here, this slide here, these risks, these are the threats to our water. And generally they fall into three major categories in our opinion. Lead and other metals, including piping materials. The next is bacteria, especially Legionella. And then the third is the chemicals, including PFAS. And we also see in some of our research that possibly there's a fourth from radioactive sources. A critical point here is that both our field experience and our extensive research that we've done with the UA, we all need to take a new approach at this. And our position is that there can be serious pitfalls of these threats. If we let one type of contaminant take up the oxygen in the room, So the danger here is when you develop the solutions to address one contaminant, we all may be missing the threats from the other contaminants. A good example that we always use in our presentations is the flint, and other people do it too, but everyone knows all about the lead problems. But many of us may not realize that they suffered a serious Legionella outbreak as well. And it was all around the same time. There's no doubt that we're facing real water crisis in America. You only need to listen to the news or the headlines in the papers across the country, on the internet. We all know about Flint, but we must know that this was just the tip of the iceberg for the water quality and the crisis that's going on. The number of frequency reports and the water threats are truly staggering. Easily we can see a few every month, and sometimes we can see several in 1 week. And we are seeing these incidents in every one of these three categories that I spoke about on the last slide. Looking at Legionella, we're seeing frequent outbreaks. These are totally preventable. If our systems are managed properly, these are occurring in all sorts of facilities as well across the country, from hotels to hospitals, and as you can see on this slide, even military facilities. The next slide here shows the serious problem with lead contaminants across the country, including several major cities after Flint. Take a look at this slide. There's Newark, Pittsburgh, Portland. Almost every major city and water utility is dealing with this issue. Even this morning, we saw some reports of Canada dealing with it. Our schools are one of the most at risk in the populations of lead. And who in America wants their kids exposed to lead when they go to school? My belief and our belief is none of us. The final is that we're witnessing problems in different types of chemicals and contamination entering our groundwater. This slide shows 4 brand new examples of PFAS. Most of the cases highlighted in the 3 contaminants in this area involve 2019 breakouts, so these are all new stories. Of course, one of the biggest stories here goes to the DoD, which recently discovered over 400 sites with PFAS contamination. So why is this important from our perspective, right? What's the problem? Our responsibility in the mechanical industry is certifying our 360,000 technicians and educating and certifying our 3,000 mechanical contractors. When we realize this is a daunting task, it's a large task. Our members in the Mechanical Contractors of America are working in these systems currently every single day. So it's just a natural progression. And we know that given the massive scope of this complexity, of this problem, this is not something that we can accomplish or conquer on our own. Honestly, I can tell you that even though we invest over $250 million a year in training our industry, the crisis is beyond that expertise that we have in the field. In fact, it's beyond any one group. It's all groups working together on a water quality task force, working to protect the health of the nation. So ladies and gentlemen, in closing, for my part today, this is your takeaway. We need water management teams in all sectors, from our schools to our military installations, for every pipe system, from every source, from the source to the end use, all of us working together to deal with this crisis. Now, General, on to our next speaker.
Thank you, Kurt. Our next speaker is Jerry Waits, the legal counsel expert on our panel. Jerry's leadership and focus have addressed the legislative and policy aspects of water quality. His vision transcends all levels of government and identifies key legislative and policy shortcomings and initiatives to improve water quality. Jerry.
Thank you, Andy. This segment of the program logically starts with a basic question. in light of the reports Kurt referred to and maybe some others that you've seen, the question is, how safe is our water? It's a little bit confusing because until a few years ago, these problems weren't surfacing. And for decades, the United States has had some of the cleanest and safest water in the world. But we have major cracks in our foundation now in our whole supply system, and including our internal systems, we'll show you. And lots of issues are surfacing and lots of proof of that is surfacing, where the reality now is many areas, many of us may be fine. There may be a significant number of other areas where problems are brewing that we don't even know about it. This is water, the pipes are underground, we don't see them. Some of the chemicals, the bacteria you don't see in the water and can have long-term health effects that we don't even know are brewing yet. And then other areas we have full manifestations of the crisis where we've seen from Albany, New York to Atlanta, Georgia, to areas of the Midwest to the West Coast of recent problems in all the contamination areas. What the United Association has done in the wake of Flint is to initially Kurt launched a pilot program when they went out into the field and they hit several cities and did some field testing and investigation right a couple years back, right in the wake of Flint, and found, sure enough, yeah, other cities had problems too. This led us to kick off a research and kind of R&D part of this program. And for a year, we dug deep into the research around the country, what was surfacing. And one of the things interesting here is we found that each of the main problems tend to be treated separately, and there wasn't any comprehensive reports on any one. It was each one was dealt separately, and we have a strong position that we need to look at all of these together. But in that extensive research, we came up with three major, fairly basic findings. That's really the theme of this program. One is that we do have major problems in our water quality today in the United States. Two is we need solutions, and we need them badly, and we need them yesterday. Three, as Kurt said, these issues are so complicated, so demanding in so many ways that you can't attack them with one discipline. You need multi-discipline teams. There's no question on the problem. We're going to show you uncontroverted, hard evidence and empirical data of very serious, widespread violations in all three of the areas. The solutions, man, we need them bigger and better, and new solutions. There's just not enough emerging right now. There are some, and we're gonna cover some of those to give you an idea of some of the things evolving. But the problem is so new and so complex that enough good solutions haven't developed, and the teams haven't been organized to put on them to develop the right approaches. And that's what's needed. Part of this is to suggest a national dialogue and discussion of the issues so more people in different sectors get informed, and then to look at forming these kind of teams that we need, which would include, frankly, not only engineers like a lot of the folks on this call, but scientists, contractors, facility managers, utility companies, a lot of the stakeholders. You need expertise from each of their areas, especially when we're trying to deal with all the problems together and a more comprehensive approach to these issues. What our research showed fairly quickly, we were into it about 6 months, and just in January of 2018, one of the most comprehensive reports yet came out. No reports to date yet, and it was a very serious research study by Columbia University and California Irvine, published under the auspices of National Academy of Sciences. And what they found was pretty startling, because they found that over 40 million Americans over a series of years are being exposed to water systems in violation of federal EPA standards. Now, those standards are put there obviously for a good reason. and you don't want to be using water that is continuously in violation of those standards, because they're mainly put in to protect against bacteria and lead and copper and other metals and some chemicals. So when you have violations, it's not good. And this study showed violations in all three of the categories, long-term over continuous years, in a lot of water systems across the country. The next slide shows one of their more specific findings, which was a lot of the worst problems are in rural areas, whether high income or low income, but in rural areas. Frankly, a lot of the water supply systems just can't keep up with the challenges of modern society and keep up with compliance with the EPA standards and rules that are meant to keep the water safe. This is significant, I think, in part because many DoD facilities, of course, are in rural areas. But it's not just rural areas, because, you know, along these, in the same time frame, you know, we saw the major outbreaks of Flint. We saw Newark, New Jersey, New York City, Detroit, Chicago, many urban areas with very serious problems as well. This data goes up through 2015, and I think all the evidence suggests that everything is really likely getting worse and not better, because we just don't have the answers and solutions yet. The Columbia report was not the only one. You know, our research found a number of other very significant findings from very reputable sources as well. On lead, the Government Accounting Office, which is the research arm of Congress, found in 2018, 37% of school districts across the country in violation of lead standards. As many of you know, lead is very dangerous for children on their nervous systems and developmental abilities. And we're looking at over a third of our schools in this country, one of the richest, most prosperous, industrialized nations in the world, with school systems that have water like this. On Legionella, in 2017, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services found a 280% increase from 2000 to 2014. It's likely a lot worse than that, because the symptoms of Legionella are almost identical to symptoms of pneumonia. And I think they're starting to catch a lot of this now, which previously has been diagnosed as pneumonia, and there's likely more of it out there. And as Kurt said, this is totally preventable when you get control of the water systems and prevent the bacteria and the conditions that, you know, go together with the bacteria to manifest this disease or cause this disease. On chemicals, one of the most complicated area, because there's literally thousands of chemicals in our environment. The EPA doesn't regulate a lot of them, including PFAS. PFAS, there's only a guideline for right now. There's not even a mandatory standard or rule. And the EPA itself found back in as early as 2010, a third of our water systems with chemicals. Chemicals can be innocent, they can be man-made, they can be natural. Sometimes chemicals are good. We use chlorine, in fact, to treat bacteria. But there's other chemicals such as PFAS and other toxic type chemicals that are very dangerous and we surely don't want in our water. The next slide is important, and here's why. If you look at this, what we do here is we show the entire U.S. water system broken into two spheres. The left side, the water utility infrastructure, is the map that Kurt showed in one of his first slides. That covers everything from the source through the piping to the water treatment plants, to additional piping to the homes and buildings, back through waste treatment, and in that circle. That's all the water infrastructure. We call it outside the fence. Inside the fence, once you cross the property line, you have the internal piping, plumbing, and mechanical systems within buildings. And this is important for several reasons. First, major problems can and are arising on both sides of this fence, on both sides of this equation. And frankly, it's somewhat hard to see which has most. There's a lot more documented on the outside, because the inside we're just starting to look at. The other thing very significant about this is that the Columbia report, which showed 40 million people, over 40 million people exposed to unsafe water systems, that report only looked outside the fence. And I should have mentioned, but the way they found the way they came to their findings is they reviewed a lot of hard data on documented EPA violations. That's how they concluded 40 million people served were being exposed. And that's probably an underestimate, because that's only the systems that EPA caught and documented. And lots of law enforcement agencies can't keep up. So 40 million may be conservative, but when you look at the fact that they were only counting outside the fence, when they're outside the fence, that may mean the 40 million could be a lot less. It could be half of really what's going on out there, because the piping systems inside our buildings are wearing out and aging, just like the antiquated infrastructure that we know is decaying. The health threats, as you may know, are very serious. Lead is dangerous for adults. I looked at this and saw headaches, irritability, depression, and memory loss, and I thought, geez, we have enough problem of that. Anyway, we don't need more. Children is very sensitive and a very serious threat, and something that just can't be tolerated. On Legionella, of course, the worst case result in death, but they have lots of respiratory problems that can get very serious as well. PFAS and other chemicals, PFAS specifically linked to cancer and other serious health problems. And that's just kind of a quick overview of what these kind of consequences can be. A quick review of some of the sources, and then we're going to, I'm going to go over a few of the policy responses and legislative policy responses, and our next two speakers are going to hit the ground hard on the field responses, which I'm sure a lot of you are most interested in. But, in developing whether field responses or policy responses, we have to understand the causes. And here there's a multitude of causes. Of course, we know infrastructure, just like our roads and bridges are wearing out, our water systems are wearing out. The problem is we can't see these, and that makes it even more challenging. Our internal systems are also wearing out, as I said, and that causes additional problems. We have all kinds of new contaminants, new chemicals that are in the environment. We use chemicals for lots of reasons, lots of legitimate reasons. The firefighting foam is one of them. And sometimes they can cause byproducts or consequences that weren't intended, and that's a whole nother area. The failure to enforce or insufficient enforcement is another driving cause, and a big one is outdated water quality policy, and our codes, our laws, and our policies on water systems. This research has convinced us that they're simply out of date. Example. The lead rule for the U.S. is at the standard, the action level, what they call, is at 15 parts per billion. And once you find more than that in 10% of the samples, then the jurisdiction has to take action. The EPA has a new rule pending, just came out a couple of weeks ago. It's been 8 years in development. There's another rule, it took them 18 years for, I think it was a chemical rule. Canada, by the way, had an outbreak in today's paper in Montreal, and notice that their lead level is at 5 parts per billion. And so arguably 15 parts per billion may not be enough. And if it's not enough, and that's what we're relying on, that's trouble. Same thing, there is no mandate, there's no rule on PFAS. And Legionella, while they test for E. coli and other bacteria, Legionella is not even tested for, inside or outside. We documented a lot of these findings I just went over in a policy brief, and we're glad to share that with anybody. Just you can email me or any of the panelists here, and we'll be glad to share that with you. Frankly, we were looking for a comprehensive report like this. About halfway through, I mentioned we found the Columbia report, but that really only covered half the universe because it did not cover the internal systems where a lot of problems are also emerging. So this pulls a lot of the stuff together, goes over the Columbia report and the other findings that we did, and we're glad to share it. It starts to outline some of the potential solutions, but it really just scratches the surface for the reasons I explained earlier, is we need a lot of work to have lots of better plans and solutions to get moving on this. As sure you can appreciate, you need both field responses in the building with the teams out there and treating this stuff, and you need legislation and policy responses. The next speakers are going to talk about the field. I'm going to just take a few slides to cover some of the policy issues, and then I have a few slides specifically on DoD facilities that may be of interest as well. Funding is huge. The needs for funding, the EPA estimates we need $1 trillion over the next 20 years, $1 trillion over the next 20 years, and that's just outside the fence. Because inside the fence is the responsibility of the property owner, the government, and it's not really regulated by the government much. Outside the fence, the EPA is looking at that, saying it's worn out, it's old, it's antiquated, $1 trillion. And, you know, Congress coming out with several $billion this year and doing what it can, but it's way beyond. As Kurt said earlier today, people, you know, we don't think twice about spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars every month on cable and our cell phone bills. People are going to have to start facing reality that we need funding, serious funding, to get our water systems right at all levels of government. There's also some reforms going on where certain private utility companies are buying the public utility companies that are not functioning well to get them in shape. In fact, the Columbia report showed that this can help the situation to some degree, if it's done right, obviously. Just a few quick things that are happening. I'm going to start right to left. On PFAS, the states aren't waiting around for the federal government, and numerous states, dozens and dozens of bills are being introduced to set PFAS limits and testing and to deal with this problem. New York has proposed a regulation recently on this, as well as the 1,4-dioxane. On lead, I mentioned the new lead rule. They're replacing lead service lines around the country. There were a great deal that go to the property from the street to the property line to the property itself, and that's necessary. There are also some legislation calling for more testing, both on the outside, more on the outside, but some on the inside. On Legionella, one of the most interesting things about New York City, it got hit hard with that, with multiple outbreaks. And, you know, there's a cooling tower on virtually every building in New York City, and that provides the air conditioning, of course, and people can get sick and die from Legionella being, when they breathe it through the air conditioning system. You can also walk by one of these water towers and ingest it. So they've passed some legislation requiring that these units be registered and inspected and reporting and those kind of things. And we may see more of that, more regulations like that across the country. A big question as you go through this and you become educated on it is, what should the law be? What should the policies be to try to get this on the right track? And that's a tricky question because it's a very complex question. You know, you literally need chemists and microbiologists and engineers. And one of the things I think we learned is that as you develop new programs in the field, that's some of the best way to get best practices to help us develop better policy. For instance, one of the things you're going to hear about from our next couple of presenters is water management plans for especially dealing with the internal systems are one of the best things we can start looking at to get a handle on this. and we need to figure out how to structure those, how to write them, how to implement them. And as we do, they may then become written into law, where we would say, whether it's a city or state law or federal law, that to address this, facility is going to have a water management program that do A, B, C. The closest thing that comes to that right now that the speakers will touch on is a directive that came out in 2017, is renewed in 2018 by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid because of Legionella outbreaks in hospitals. Hot button area right now, one of the worst. And they have a mandate, virtually all hospitals and other healthcare facilities around the country have to implement water management programs according to certain industry code standards and to deal with this. And we may be seeing that more going from healthcare industry to other industries, because we've seen people get sick and die in hospitality industries, and now commercial building owners need to start looking at this as well. So there's a lot to be done on the policy side, including the industry codes and standards. In fact, we may need to rewrite all the plumbing codes across the country in 50 states and mechanical codes. Why? Because we've never had to worry about it before. And so while the plumbing codes say the water has to be potable and basically safe, that's all it says. It doesn't require any testing or monitoring or water management programs. And that's evolving to be a deficiency that we can no longer take for granted. A couple slides on DoD, and I'm going to turn to the next speaker. As Kurt mentioned, 400 facilities, over 400 facilities with PFAS contamination issues, $2 billion cleanup costs. The number of sites and the cost goes exponentially higher when you look at other contamination issues that DoD is wrestling with besides PFAS. So it's a real major problem. Lead contamination, we found at least on one case in Joint Base San Antonio, and there was another recent case as well. I believe it was Georgia, and it just goes to show DoD is not immune to these other issues. There's Fort Benning, Georgia. Also, there was a lead contamination case of samples coming back in violation. Legionella outbreaks overseas in Germany, there were a couple in 2018, and then some earlier ones. The one thing I want to pause here with is I've worked a lot in contracting and procurement, and DoD, as it wrestles with these issues, and this was something I thank Andy for. He said, you might want to look at this because as DoD wrestles with this, they have to look at this in the procurement context, which is really probably three types. One, when they're hiring people to help deal with the PFAS as the big issue and the most immediate issue, but then also as they may procure water supplies from one supplier or another, and then third, when, like the rest of the company and the other countries and the rest of these sectors, they may need to start looking at water management plans for their buildings, and you may need to procure people from that. So as people familiar with these issues may know, a good thing to do, especially in a complex area like this, maybe you look at doing an RFI, request for information, before you even do an RFP to find the people that can help you with this. And that allows you to assess the market. And I have a few notes there to look at on assessing the market, finding the right kind of expertise, including the team and how you might put a team together, and then use that to inform the drafting of the RFP. And it's sufficiently complex that, certain DoD organizations may want to bring in technical consultants, including engineers and even scientists to help, write the specs for these RFP to get the job done right, because it's highly complicated. One thing our guys will touch on in a minute is there is a new certification, a code certification by the American Society of Sanitary Engineers for certifying both contractors and technicians in water management programs. And we're getting a lot of our people on board with that because we think it's a good program and it's a good way to ensure some quality control in the people that are trying to deal with this. And that's a code organization that's already out there, and it's a good thing to look at when finding the right people for this. Last, the policy responses for the DoD right now. There's several things going on. You have to commend Secretary Esper's very first day of office. As some of you may know, he issued a call to arms by establishing a PFAS task force to start dealing with this problem in a very serious way. In addition to that, on the field side, DoD is doing everything. We're replacing the firefighting foam that has caused a lot of PFAS problems, to moving to bottled water, filters, developing new treatments for contaminated water, and shifting supply sources. The bottom line, I think, for this part of the presentation is, look, the DoD is a microcosm of the rest of the country. That is our perspective here. And as you can see, the DoD is having different issues in all three areas, different problems. And so is the healthcare industry, the hospitality industry. And what we're seeing and what we believe is that it would make a lot of sense to develop a more holistic, comprehensive, integrated approach that is not out there, that is not being done. For instance, you don't want to be an engineer helping DoD with the PFAS, and you get a program together, you're treating a facility, get things going in the right direction, and then the next week or the next month, you find that there's a Legionella outbreak or a lead problem. It could happen. It happened with Flint, in fact, as Kurt mentioned. And that's why we say to DoD or anybody, jurisdictions, states, cities, a more comprehensive approach where you can look at these problems together, including through water management programs, is something that is really needed. And it's needed within the DoD world as well as the rest of the country. And as Kurt also mentioned, we need to put our heads together and combine the expertise in the various disciplines to have our best chance at getting ahead of this. Andy?
Thank you, Jerry. All right. Our next speaker is Rich Bankowski. He's a training expert on our panel. And you can see the numerous experiences and qualifications in areas related to water quality that Rich has pursued and mastered over his 40 years in this business. He leads the training initiatives of United Association's Water Quality Program. Rich.
Thank you, General. We're happy to be here today and have this discussion with everybody, and we thank you all for your time. And for a generation, we want to look at how we define water quality, what the formula was as it was expressed, and to recognize also sustainable initiatives that would secure long-term availability of water for the next generation and beyond. Building owners and manufacturers, facility managers work to achieve water conservation. Plus, there was an added goal to save energy and lower the cost of heating and distributing water. So the intersection of public health and sustainability demands a third part into the quality formula, and that is risk. If building occupants consume less water, then that'll increase the age of the water in the pipe. If the temperature of the delivered water is lowered to 120 degrees, then Legionella or other pathogens will amplify. So what solves this formula? How do we solve this? It's balance. Control measures to keep water moving and stored above 140 degrees are simple and available. The sustainable measures weren't wrong to implement. We're still going to keep being sustainable and looking out for the next generation. Risk assessment of all the pipe systems with informed decisions by the water management team will promote water security and resilience for all building occupants. So which pipe systems are at risk? All of them. They all are. The threats are numerous and unpredictable. In the headlines, we hear about cooling towers. Every day we interact with plumbing fixtures, and our families will walk right past the water feature, aspirating the mist without breaking a straw. In sprinkler systems, by design and the grace of God, the water will never move. But keep in mind, the threats presented are without bias. Technicians and craftsmen working on any of the piping arrangements have the same or maybe more exposure to the hazards as the general public. So let's look at our challenges today. If we look at the type of building that we live in, or that we work in, or do any kind of operation in, categorizing the building water system is based on the control points mapped out in the flow diagrams. Therefore, pipe systems for the facility are determined based on the complexity of the arrangement and selection of the equipment and devices. Commercial structures and healthcare facilities have similar building water systems, which are comprised of point of entry, cold and hot water distribution, sanitary waste. More resources may be designed into the building, such as fire suppression, decorative fountains, and ice machines. But who's in the building? After identifying the pipe system and devices in the building, it's time to evaluate the occupants in the facility. Building populations are stratified from lowest to highest risk. When we discussed any type of pipe systems residing in the building, common elements of construction for commercial and healthcare markets are shown to be varied. Here, there's a clear separation of two types. As one group, the healthcare occupants may be immune compromised, and that's the patients. So in order to balance the sustainable initiatives, we need to apply control measures to promote water security. Lastly, we look at published documents. We have ASHRAE and ASSE that will, in a couple of minutes, we'll discuss who those organizations are. But let's also remember that the published documents are standards and guidelines, and they can deliver compliance for the occupants. The ASSE 12,000 certifies everyday behaviors and skill sets that can verify and validate ASHRAE 188 and ASHRAE 12. So who is ASHRAE? The American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers. Founded over 100 years ago, it's a global society, and they look at not only publishing standards and guidelines for water quality, but also energy, the air that we breathe, ventilation. Also, for the air that we breathe, the filters that are in our mechanical systems. There are many parts of the mechanical system that ASHRAE looks to establish guidelines that can be adopted. When guidelines and standards are adopted, that they become mandates in the local areas, and the authorities having jurisdiction then will look for compliance. So the compliance path for a lot of the ASHRAE standards and guidelines applied to water quality occurs through ASSE, which is an international program that American Society of Sanitary Engineers, and they discuss and they outline behaviors and criteria for how we would manage the systems, monitor them, maintain them, and also document and communicate. We have not talked about that yet, but documentation and communication are very key to the success in a compliance path. So what does compliance mean for ASHRAE 188 and 12? ASHRAE 188 is very straightforward. Risk assessment for every aspect of the piping industry, for new and existing buildings, from design to replacement. Attention must be given to all premise piping, delivering or distributing potable and non-potable water. Furthermore, every action or inaction must be documented and on file for appraisal by the authority having jurisdiction. All commercial, institutional, industrial buildings are required to create a water management team to formulate a water management plan wherever ASHRAE 188 is adopted or mandated. So a companion piece to that now is ASHRAE Guideline 12, and it's intended to provide guidance useful for implementation. This guideline is for use by building owners of human-occupied buildings, those involved in design. Now listen closely, because this covers the life cycle of a building. Design, construction, installation, commissioning, management, operation, maintenance, and service of centralized building water systems and components. So what's recommended here by the standards and guidelines is a water management program. So what is that? Water management programs identify hazardous conditions and take steps to minimize growth and spread of Legionella and other waterborne pathogens in building systems. Developing and maintaining a water management program is a multi-step, multidisciplinary that requires a continuous review. 7 key activities are routinely performed in successful water management programs. First of all, you need to establish a water management team. They describe the building water systems using flow diagrams. They identify where Legionella or other pathogens can grow and spread. Then decisions are made about where control measures should be applied and how to monitor. Ways to establish and intervene, ways that when control limits are not met. And we also must make sure the program is running and is designed and is effective. Documentation and communication of all these activities is critical. In general, the principles of effective water management include maintaining water temperatures outside the ideal range for Legionella growth and other pathogens, preventing water stagnation, ensuring an adequate disinfection, most of all maintaining premise plumbing, equipment, fixtures to prevent scale, corrosion, and biofilm growth, all of which provide a habitat and nutrients for Legionella and other pathogens. So the members of the team will work together to identify ways to minimize growth and spread of pathogens, conduct routine checks, and then take action if a problem is found. Looking at the compliance path inside of these documents, simply put, these are action verbs of mapping, analyze, and identify hazards, implement the control measures, and you must monitor and verify corrective actions, and then validate the results. All of these exist inside of ASHRAE 188, and here are the specific sections to it that you can look at, start to finish. These action verbs just mentioned are expected to have programmatic elements that include trained personnel, reliable and repeatable tasks performed on equipment and devices with documentation and communication, plus, again, the plan for an appropriate response to the incident. If we take a deeper dive into ASHRAE 12, there's criteria for management of identified risks. And just scanning the slide here, you can see attention must be made to water temperature, dead legs, cross connections, water age, things that we think about, but now what we know about water, we must act on. Action is the key here to remediate systems when you identify any of these risks outlined in ASHRAE 12. So what's the answer? How do we get through this compliance path? The delivery method for ASHRAE 188 and 12 relies on trained and certified craftsmen employed by ASSE 12,000 contractors. So we look at tools, trucks, and technicians aligned with educated management can verify and validate compliance to the recommended standards and guidelines. The water quality program is supported by a national training initiative available at over 300 training centers in the U.S. and Canada. Certified instructors will certify both the contractor and the craftsman in ASSE 12,000. This program includes some irreducible elements, which include a handbook that can navigate the path to compliance, contractor certification aids in program administration and dispatch of craftsmen and technicians. And also member certification, technicians can be certified to demonstrate to the customer and the consumers that in the field, the water quality technician has the applicable skill set and knowledge for risk assessment and the application of control measure use. The handbook is simply intended not for just the classroom, but also the contractor administration of the program and field execution. It's a compilation of individual documents assembled to promote understanding of many layers of the water quality crisis. So I want to thank you all for your time today and look forward to your questions. General?
Thank you, Rich. Our fourth and final speaker is Chris Carter. Chris is our Captain of Industry panel member, Vice President in a company that deals with water quality all the time, in construction, operation and maintenance, and services to facilities nationwide. Chris knows the boots on the ground aspects and requirements to address water quality in our nation's infrastructure. Chris.
Thank you, General, and thank you to our audience for sharing their time with us today to learn more about this really important topic. So, as the General stated, I'm the boots on the ground. We deal with this absolutely every day. And one thing that wasn't stated is I've been a licensed plumber for my entire career. And so I've spent my whole life, adult life anyway, watching out for the safety of the nation through good municipal water supplies and getting clean drinking water. Which is one of those things that separates our first world from third world conditions. So we're really, it's very, very important that we continue that legacy. So if you see, hold on, I need to move. There we go. Sorry, I'm having trouble with the interface there. So I'd like to share a few of the tactics that are being developed and implemented to protect the people who live and work in and around the facilities all over the United States. So our team refers to this as kind of the ground game. So if you think about college football, and I'm a big LSU Tigers fan, so go Tigers. But we got the ground game we were always really good at. Jerry talked about the air game, right? So all the regulation coverage that we're trying to get put in place. So that takes a lot longer to put together. And we hope that both of those come together for the Tigers when they play the Tide next week. So, all right, we're having fun with tech. There we go. All right, so key market sectors that are impacted by this. So when we look at the issues, we feel like that it really falls into and can be categorized into some major market sectors that impact the entire United States, but also show up on DoD facilities as well. So the first market, and the one that we most often hear about, is healthcare. And we really wonder, like, why would healthcare be the area that gets the most coverage there? So the reason behind that is the CMS document that we discussed a little bit earlier. So it was generated in 2017, created a ton of awareness because the healthcare industry, in order to accept payments for Medicare and Medicaid services, had to be in alignment with the requirements to have a water management plan in place. So when this was rolled out in 2017, there was a lot of confusion that was created, and people were scurrying to try to figure out, how do we get in alignment with this, because it's going to put our cash flow at risk. And so as they asked a lot of questions in 2017, 2018 actually, CMS issued some additional clarifications for what it meant to put together a really good water management program. Now, all of this was really focused on Legionella as the primary exposure. And so when the CDC researched it, their investigation found that 9 out of 10 of all outbreaks could have been prevented through better water management. So better control of the systems that expose people to water and aerated forms of water that could be inhaled into their lungs. And so when you look at that, 9 out of 10, that's a pretty strong percentage to be able to impact and proactively mitigate the risk in this area. So obviously healthcare was one of the leading areas where they developed an actionable item. And so how did that come together? We talked about ASHRAE, and they put together the ASHRAE 12 and 188. So as Rich really did a great job of describing, it's a formula for how to proactively mitigate the risk of exposure from water systems. So why are contractors talking about this? So the CMS document clearly defined a group of people that should be involved in the development of the water management programs. So in that document, you see the list here, and clearly identified about halfway through is contractors and consultants. So people that know about systems, know about water treatment, and are in a position to help the facilities. And sometimes the water management leader might be a director of nursing or a doctor that probably doesn't have a lot of knowledge base about facilities and piping, like those of us in the engineering and construction community. So making sure that they had contractors as a part of this is a really important part of making sure you can do a good job for the facility. So how do we engage when we're working with the water management program? So a big part of what contractors can help with is identifying piping systems, understanding the way that they work appropriately, understanding what a good maintenance plan looks like for various aspects of the water systems, and understanding when changes are made or revisions are made to a system, what that impact can be on the way that the water moves about and the way that people are exposed to it. So when you look at this chart, the contractor plays a big role in understanding, where are the control points, where should they be? So you look at water heaters, hot tubs, things that mechanical contractors and technicians are very involved in every day. Understanding what the control measures should be, should something change, and understanding how to measure them. And then the monitoring piece of it. So the technicians that we have that are certified through the ASSE standard have the ability to help with sampling and understanding the chain of custody that needs to go along with that, and getting the samples off to a certified laboratory to feed back into the water management program for the facility, and to give good data on, is the program working? So when we find that it's within limits, we document those results and we don't have to worry about it anymore, right? Until the next sample point comes along. But if it's out of limits, documenting those results, but then also understanding what corrective actions should be put into place is a big part of what we are able to do. So if you think about a dead leg in a piece of pipe where the water is not circulating, and depending on the temperature, if it has a Legionella growth in it, at some point when the system is drained or there's a low pressure, that Legionella could be pulled out into the rest of the system. So understanding when your exposure happened, that you took a measurement and you said, hey, there's a problem here. What are we going to do now to fix that? So a lot of times our healthcare customers are leaning on us to say, hey, we got a bad reading. What can we do to mitigate this going forward? So that's a pretty involved process, obviously, but not every engagement is exactly that involved. So in some instances, we'll have a smaller facility, a long-term care type facility, call up and just need some consulting as they're working their way through their plan. So you can imagine a CEO of a nursing facility, a nursing home facility, obviously probably doesn't know a ton about the systems in his building or her building. And as they work through that document from CMS, there's a lot of confusing facts in there, and it says contact a contractor or contact your water utility. So when we get those calls, we're more than eager to help them understand what that system looks like and where the exposures could be. In a recent engagement, I had a CEO talking to me about the water feature in his building. So he has elderly patients that could have compromised immune systems. He said, how could this water feature be impacting? And what should I do to mitigate it? And how should I measure that going forward? And those are the types of consulting engagements that we see routinely. So obviously, healthcare is pretty well defined in the way that they're approaching the management of their water systems. And there's other areas that obviously other sectors that we need to look into as well. So DoD is one. There's been a lot of discussion about PFAS, so I'm not going to beat that one to death. But some of the emerging responses that we have discovered through our research. So the Baltimore Corps of Engineers, they built this mini reservoir to help understand how PFAS moves between various water systems underground. And in their study, their goal is to understand if it's moving and we're trying to treat it and what happens beyond that. So obviously a huge investment there to try to understand how to break down these chemicals and get it out of water systems even when they're underground. There's also advanced oxidative process in Long Island, New York, and a lot of filtration things. But all of these are very expensive, and none of them are 100% effective without an immense amount of investment to get through. So outside of that, and something that impacts every one of us, are municipal water systems. And so there was a question posted by one of the attendees asking, do we see these type of issues in various sectors based on city systems, municipal systems, rural systems, public-private systems? So what we can say with confidence is 5% of all systems that report to the EPA have violations at almost any given time. So I would say most systems have the risk of this, and fortunately for many of us, 95% are in pretty good shape according to EPA and all the things they measure. That doesn't necessarily cover some chemicals that we've talked about or Legionella as an exposure. So we only know what's measured, and we know that what's measured, we have a 5% chance, and those are not all just rural systems. And we think about Flint, we think about the city of Chicago schools, which I'll talk about next. If I can move. So in lead contamination. So one of the best things that you can do to mitigate lead exposure is to replace lead service lines. And that sounds like a great idea, but it's also a very expensive and a long-term problem. So the current regulation is for if your parts per billion is at 15, which is the EPA measurement, that you don't want to exceed that threshold, you have to replace 3% of your lead domestic water lines per year. And so, for example, in the city of Detroit, they said that could take all the way to the year 2040 under the current rules. So obviously, still a lot of exposure is going to happen between now and 2040. So we have to think of other things that we can do. So the Chicago school system has a systematic system flushing process, and I think one of the other attendees made a comment in our chat line about maybe LA schools having the same process. And what they found was if you run the water for 3 minutes, it's not quite effective enough to get the lead out. So you need to run it for more like 5 minutes, which to us feels like a pretty broad discussion and probably not the right solution, right? So ultimately we've got to see better solutions coming through. We're measuring things, we're understanding that there are problems, but the solutions we're coming up with are, they just feel like they fall short in our opinion. There's also a really interesting technology that's coming out to increase the scale growth in lead pipes by running a current through them to speed up the scale growth and therefore reducing the leach rate from the pipe into the water. So very interesting technology, but another extremely expensive method of accomplishing this solution. So we had to excavate pipes and on each end and get fine through them, and the technology that goes into that is extremely expensive, which means not many people are going to do much about that in the short run. And that's exposure for our children. So we know we have an active problem in that area, and that's municipalities and education, where you would think our regulations should be helping us more. So another area where we feel like it's starting to get a lot more exposure to this is hospitality. So in the hospitality industry, we know there's going to be major change coming, primarily because it's driven through the insurance industry. So in a recent paper to their clients, one of the major insurance providers for the hospitality industry said, we really have a problem with exposure to Legionella. It's creating risk for our clients and risk for us as an insurance carrier. And their answer is to manage this risk through implementation of the standards in ASHRAE 188 and 12. So the way that they're enforcing this is the insurance rates that the hospitality industry will be paying if they're not compliant will be different than if they are compliant. So as you think about emerging solutions and an industry where a lot of people can be exposed in a hurry, like the hospitality industry, what it's telling us is water management programs are one of the most effective ways to be proactive about the water systems in your facilities. And we know that the Department of Defense has facilities that are similar to all of these other sectors. And so we think it's really important that you get the exposure and the engineers and the people that serve these facilities and people that lead these facilities get exposure to these topics, so that if you're not familiar with water management programs, you're getting there, because in our opinion, that is the very best way to be proactive in developing and maintaining an effective solution going forward. General, I'm going to flip it back to you.
Thank you, Chris. Well, this moves us on. You know, being exposed to the installation priorities within DoD, the word resilience kept just ringing in my ears as these speakers were talking. And we've put together a few recommended next steps. We want to make sure the dialogue continues. We want to make sure that this isn't just a shot out that goes into a file cabinet and gets forgotten. Obviously, it cannot be that way. So we put together Our panel and the organizations they represent compiled these next steps recommendations for consideration and hopefully follow-up actions that we can work on together. First, I'd like to ask Kurt Steenhoek to address bullets number 1 and 2.
Thanks, Andy. Bet. Yes, if we take a look at number 1, you know, if anybody in this webinar has any questions for us in the panel, we would input. You know, please do not hesitate to send us an email, and we can maybe address your issues on those, or comments, you know, on the water quality paper if you want to have a copy of that water quality paper. To address number 2, you know, we would be happy to meet with any facility managers to discuss the problems out there and show them, you know, kind of what we see and how we see it, and, you know, obviously give them from the mechanical industry perspective of what we bring to the table, because, you know, like we said, we can't deal with this on our own. We need more people to the table to deal with it together, but, you know, we're in those systems every single day, and we definitely play a part in that. So look forward to, you know, future meetings with some facility managers within the DoD. Andy?
And continuing that theme throughout the rest of the recommended next steps, it's really all about connecting the dots, creating coalitions and partnerships among organizations that have not had the opportunity to work together on this. Firstly, the water, wastewater, utilities privatization system owners, who are responsible for delivering water quality to the installations where they are the managers of the water and wastewater systems, are a tremendously strong source of experiences, lessons learned, the pressure that's on them to clean up the contaminants we've discussed. And they have a group called the Utilities Privatization Partners, and that group can be a voice of the system owners working together to address these issues. And it's a good element to bring to the table to compare notes, work together, and craft strategies that can address this for the Department of Defense and our military installations. And I think SAME is a broad connective base that can open many doors to Department of Defense leaders and industry leaders that cannot be opened directly. You don't want to offend a commander who owns a technician, a scientist, or an engineer who down in the trenches working 80 hours a week and try to access that person, but SAME can do that. And we'd like to keep SAME in the focus with some of the other professional organizations that have been mentioned here in order for us to be able to work together. And for want of a better term, I thought the word task force has been a bit overused. So we'll talk about it as a leadership coalition that includes Department of Defense leaders, industry, labor, academia, and professional engineering organizations, all mentioned today, to synchronize and develop response strategies. We would really like your thoughts on that. Those who are attending here and represent particular aspects, obviously an expert in the business, a stakeholder, somebody who's impacted by water quality issues, we'd like to hear from you. So, we're going to take a look at questions that have been coming in. We may not be able to answer all of them, hence our listing of email addresses, and we definitely want to hear from you. If we don't get to what you posted in the chat line today, we want to be able to do that as a follow-up. Okay, so I've got a good stack of questions here. I'd like to kick it off with a question for Rich Benkowski. Can the United Association's application handbook the path to compliance that you talked about be adopted for federal government and DoD use? And how would you go about working this with DoD leaders?
Yes, General, there are elements in there that can be adopted. As I said, there are some, it's a compilation of other documents, including the water policy brief, but it also has some documents, some original documents in there for sampling, some documents for building a matrix of what the building type is, how to classify the occupant, and it talks about the process of risk assessment, which, one thing we must remember, this is not a water testing program. This is a risk assessment program. If water is tested and found to be, subpar or needs some action items without risk assessment, then we really haven't found the source. So the handbook is good for the risk assessment process and determining where the source of any problems may be with the water on any mechanical system. So yes, it can be adopted in ways to promote good water quality.
Thank you, Rich. I have one here for Jerry Waits. Considering that all levels of government need to address water quality policies, at what level and through which organizations would you begin the process to set the example for others?
That's an interesting question, General. Often, when we go top down, right, we go federal and then down. But after now 30 years in Washington, I've come to think that maybe it's the opposite way. And truly, I think I've mentioned how long some of those EPA rules and policies have taken to develop. State governments and local governments are not waiting for them. And we find some of the best solutions are being developed on the ground. So I would say it almost goes the other way. So when states and local governments begin adopting better approaches, whether it's mandating water management programs, putting in new lead standards or chemical standards, that may be something to look at. And as it may drum up some support across the country from the ground up, and may result in some of the better policies and may move faster, actually.
Thanks, Jerry. Chris mentioned in his briefing that he was seeing some of the traffic that's coming in on the chat line about different types of water system ownerships, city, regional districts. Are water problems found across these types of agencies? I think that there's no question that that is the case. Nobody's got the magic solution. And next question here for Chris that follows on that theme. Are water management programs a requirement for DoD facilities?
Not to my knowledge currently. So there is a reference to 188 in a few of the UFC documents, but it's not specific to the water management side of it, just more of how you're addressing water systems. So what we would kind of shape here is it doesn't have to be mandated to be effective. And so the exposure here is understanding that there is something that's a real, a proven program that helps facility managers identify risk within their water systems, put in control measures and standards to make sure that they're not falling behind. And it's a proactive approach to mitigating that risk. And so I think that's the real awareness that we're trying to generate, is it exists, and there's a workforce that is capable of helping to develop that on the ground level. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Let me toss one here to Kurt. Kurt, this relates to your comments about our first couple of actions, I think, and what would you recommend as a first step forward following today's webinar in organizing and synchronizing meetings among DoD and industry stakeholders to address water quality issues?
Thanks, General. In thinking about the answer for that is that really kind of a two-prong approach. Is from the top down, you know, we can meet with the leaders of the responsible parties of the water facilities and give them the high level approach and tell them what's going on. And then the second part of that would be is the people responsible for actually taking care of the systems. Part of our training that we have is, it's a 3-day training that we do for all of our people. And the first day is a fundamental side that we bring in all our contractors and end users, and we've used this in other industries and it's really worked out well. Sometimes we'll bring in major water utilities to listen to it as well, and it's really gone over very favorably with the people that we've talked to so far in other industries. So that's, you know, that's the answer I would bring to the table, is it's 2-part meetings, and because it really applies to the 2 different groups differently. The ones that are actually responsible for doing the action items like Rich was talking about, that would be really good for them to see the process and how we take care of water management programs.
Okay. Well, and I think that, as I mentioned, the partnership with SAME and other professional organizations that deal with this all the time, but we've not been able to cross the barriers between each as well as we would hope to see. And maybe we can work together in establishing some milestones in the future as to meetings, sessions, opportunities to review in greater detail than we've had today. Question for Jerry. In terms of internal piping for systems within buildings, what do you see that might be coming down the pike in terms of future laws and policies that we might need to regulate those internal systems?
Thanks, General. Well, one, as I mentioned, you know, the laws and policies have not kept up with our modern society. They've not kept up with the new threats that are emerging, and they need some overhaul. And society goes through this from time to time, and they have to develop new laws and codes and standards to protect safety in the face of new threats arising, new chemicals coming into the systems, all of that. And a lot of the way things work in this industry, and Rich alluded to this, is you have these codes and standards that are developed by these number of the groups that he mentioned. Some people on the call might be in these groups. They're staffed a lot by engineers and other people in the business. And so they develop the codes. Okay, right now, there's no water management programs required for internal buildings. There's some people, and we've been out to every leading group, and some people believe that there may be a day may come when every building has to have a water management program. That's not off the wall, and it could be in our future because we have to do something. The threats are coming, kind of fast and hard. So what I would see is that the engineers and the contractors, people out there dealing with it on a day-to-day basis, will start informing the code people and as to what to do. And what they may start doing is requiring that facility owners, building owners, start having water management programs. That's one thing we may see. It's already required in health facilities for across the country, hospitals and nursing homes and so forth. And by the way, I imagine DoD does have some hospitals, and they're not required to do this now, but they might want to start looking at it. If the federal government is convinced that every healthcare facility under their Medicare jurisdiction should do it, DoD people may want to look at that, even if it's they're not mandated. They could do it as a policy, and it might be wise because Legionella can strike other hospitals. It can strike any hospitals. But on the industry codes are likely going to have to be redone. And as I mentioned too, that can be sort of informed by field work, as people like Rich and Chris are out there developing solutions and trying to find the best practices that get fed back to the code bodies. What the heck do we put in these water management programs? What exactly risk assessment, as Rich mentioned, as well as testing sampling. What kind of things do you test for? There's a lot of ingredients out there or contaminants that could be tested that we're not testing for. And then how do you remediate and all those kind of things. So I see the code on the internal building, which fortunately we haven't had to worry about for a long time, for decades now. We've never had to worry about it. That's why the laws and codes don't do anything right now, because it hasn't been a problem. That's all changing, and we have to deal with that.
Well, and I think that, you know, when you have a utilities privatization system and you have a point of demarcation at 5 feet outside of a building, there is a change in responsibility and who's got to take care of what's inside. And with regard to utilities privatization, we have a question. If the provision of water becomes privatized on bases like other utilities, how are those programs granted? Are they leases or are they actual ownership? I can address that. It's actual ownership. It goes through a solicitation, obviously, and a contract for 50 years is awarded, but it actually becomes a bill of sale that for perpetuity of that system, water, wastewater, and electrical and gas on the power side are under the ownership of that provider, that system owner. It is an amazing system to bring industry and Department of Defense together in a coalition or partnership that brings the latest state-of-the-art technical capabilities that we see in private industry brought to military installations. Okay. I'm looking through here. One question about the Secretary of Defense's PFAS task force, and is that too narrow an approach? I think that as we discussed in this webinar, a high concentration on a particular contaminant to water can be risky. It can lead to missing other things. And we don't want to question the Secretary of Defense's wisdom, but certainly it is not adequate to only address that particular contaminant. Question for Rich. How important is mapping a system for a building?
Well, mapping is one of the core elements of understanding where any risks or hazards may be present. And understand, you know, even if you have drawings, or whether they're electronic drawings or AutoCAD drawings, walking your systems and knowing where somebody may have added a valve that could now be a dead leg. And if there's a fire in the vicinity and the pressure in the building drops, that dead leg becomes a risk. So walking the building and understanding how the systems are piped, what devices are connected, allows you to assess the risk in a way that you can take action. But that's for all systems, not just potable and non-potable, but for your hydronic systems, the chilled water, the hot water, and also the fire suppression systems.
Thank you, Rich. Another one for you, I think hits into your area. Has ASHRAE Standard 188 been adopted by any UFC?
Help me understand the UFC.
Questioner, can you elaborate on your question there?
This is Rick Cox here. Let me kind of give some context. The UFC is it's like a unified facilities criteria, and that's where the Department of Defense attempts to jointly develop criteria that applies to all services, and they have multiple areas, maybe fire protection and other areas as well.
All right. Well, that'd be a very good place to start a conversation to discuss it. And we're having a similar parallel, let's say, a conversation with FGI, which is the Guidelines Institute that provides language and for the hospitals to comply with on the JCO inspection. So UFC would probably be a good place to get some understanding and some ways to implement the risk assessment for buildings.
Let me just add to that, Andy, too, if I could. You know, what we've learned, obviously, is the healthcare industry is out in front on this, and because they have some of the biggest threats on the Legionella especially. Now, their water management programs are highly sophisticated. They're very thick books, and it's a multifaceted team of doctors, and so some of those guidelines can be used. But what you can do, and Rich and Chris can both attest to this, is when you move from the healthcare to a commercial building or other, barracks or other facilities that the DoD may have, you can cherry pick from that approach and simplify it a great deal. But there's a lot of good information and guidelines on assessments, on mapping, and things like that would apply to any building. It would just be a lot easier once you get beyond healthcare.
Thank you, Jerry. Can you offer, anyone on the panel, can you offer your perspectives on how do municipal systems compare to private water company run systems when it comes to water quality issues? Is there a track record? Is there a distinction that has been seen between those?
I guess, Andy, I have to address that. It's Jerry. I think you find across the country all kinds of things. You find, public systems that do a good job, public systems that don't do a good job. That's clear. Private systems, I think they probably do generally better. And I'm sure they're not all perfect, but private systems, private companies that do this, I think have a bit of a better track record. And the Columbia study, in fact, had a kind of point blank finding that the private systems, the research showed that there were less violations when the private systems did it. There's a logic, common sense behind that. In the rural areas, you have these small jurisdictions. They simply cannot handle it, the capacity on what it takes to keep the water clean. The private companies that come in and they may have to raise the water rates because that's what it takes, but that's a documented finding there that they tend to do a better job. And that's one of the most significant, I think, points to that answer.
Thank you, Jerry. Another one for you. Other than looking for PFAS and looking to stop buying PFAS materials, what is the latest on any actions taken to remediate PFAS? There seems to be a big ongoing debate about establishing PFAS action levels, and obviously we've seen a lot of traffic on that DoD. Any thoughts, Jerry?
Well, that is one of the most complicated, the whole chemical area. The lead we can figure out, we can deal with. The bacteria is more complicated, but, with monitoring and testing and water management, risk assessment, we can deal with. Chemicals are very tricky because, and there's all sorts of, this goes across, but, you can have PFAS where some bad company purposely dumped and caused that problem. The military was simply using, firefighting foam, and who knew that this would cause a problem? So it's all over in terms of causation. But in dealing with it, in trying to get your head around the best way to approach it, I think we have remediation, as in the case of the military and other industry. We have to figure out how do we, it's like the cleanup sites from the EPA, how do we deal with those to protect those communities? And that's going to be very tricky. And then also, how do we go forward to try to prevent this kind of stuff in the future? And frankly, for both of those, this underscores the need, something Kurt mentioned at the very outset. No one discipline can figure this out. Plumbers and pipe fitters can't figure it out. Contractors can't. DoD facility people can't. Scientists can't alone. Engineers. We need to get people around the table. And it's going to take, some doing to get that. And we need it at a field level where you have a multifaceted team, and we need it at a national level when we're talking about policy. And as we do this, I can't help to think, but I have to commend you, General, because you've done an excellent job as a taskmaster here and a first-class job of keeping this focused and keeping us all on point. And we're going to need people like you to help guide those teams. As I was thinking, how the heck would you manage a team like this? We need good leaders. And I kick that back to you.
Thank you, Jerry. Well, Rick Cox, I'm hearkening to your note here about UFC updates. You talk about the need for a DoD advocate, and certainly when we plow through Department of Defense and the multiple agencies, I don't say this pejoratively, but there does seem to be a passing of blame from agency to agency, from manager to manager, and the advocacy aspect and the holistic approach to water quality and being able to engage the leadership, the stakeholders within Department of Defense, and keep this dialogue going, I think is a critical component of our purpose here. I think we're about out of time. I want to flip to the next chart to just offer our thanks to some really key people who made this webinar possible. First, Joe Schrodel is Executive Director of SAME. He sort of took what was a figment of imagination in trying to put together a panel presentation for JETC, and it got voted down at the time, and Joe said, hey, I think you need to do a webinar on this. This is too important to not present. And so, Joe, we certainly thank you. And then John Medeiros and Bell Febraro for coaching us on how to do it. And Rick for sponsorship and giving us the good coaching on how to clean up our voluminous stuff that we wanted to express to this audience today. The United Association and MCAA for their tremendous investment in our nation's water quality, as evidenced by our panel speakers. Great job, panel speakers. Thanks so much for your efforts on this. And then I think one more, we'll go to the final. And we hope to see you at the Small Business Conference coming up in Dallas. Also think about the possibility of having water quality be an issue that can be discussed at JETC 2020. And those who are influential at the local posts, we would love to hear recommendations about how we can get together and talk about this. Rick, any final thoughts about this final chart?
Yeah, a few things. First off, each of you that's an SAME member, you're allowed to adjust your membership in the different committees, aka communities of interest. So log into your account and select the committees that you would like to be on the mailing list for and involved in. That's how you get to know about this. So if you checked environmental COI, then you would have gotten an email from me about an hour ago, kind of outlining what the short-term activities are. This SAME is here for you, and we need to represent your interest, but we need to know what that is. And one way to do that is, one, to show up at the events. Small Business Conference and JTC are the two major ones. At Small Business Conference, we'll be meeting on Thursday, November 21st, and also I'll be moderating a session with the EPA and GSA. So especially with the interest in OASIS and some of the other GSA best-in-class contracts, it should be another good session. Call for presentations is open December 16th. Do not be discouraged with the mindset as though they won't pick me. Trust me, we will. We want to make sure that we represent as broad a community as we can. And we don't want any single company to dominate and don't want that perception thereof. And then finally, JETC is coming up. It's a centennial celebration. We've got 100 years of SAME, and it's going to be an exciting program where we showcase the history of our nation's infrastructure has evolved. And so just think back 100 years ago, we didn't have a national highway system, and we didn't have a lot of conveniences that we do today. So it's going to be a great program. So you can get on SME.org. And our webpage is the Communities of Interest, which is /environmental. So get involved, and we look forward to seeing you.
Thank you.